The morning mist clung to the Blue Ridge Mountains like secrets whispered between the peaks, and in that gray half-light before dawn, Elena Brooks pressed her back against the rough bark of an ancient oak, her heart hammering so loud she was certain it would give her away. 3 days she'd been running through these endless hills, 3 days since she'd fled Charlotte with nothing but the clothes on her back and terror nipping at her heels like hounds. Her fine city shoes were ruined now, leather torn and soles thin as paper, her once pristine traveling dress stained with mud and pine sap. But it wasn't the discomfort that made her hands shake as she peered through the morning gloom. It was the stories. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Every soul in Pine Creek Township had warned her about the mountain man who lived up on Cedar Ridge. Thomas Wade, they called him, though most folks just whispered that scarred devil when they thought the wind wouldn't carry their words. The children crossed themselves when they spoke his name, and the women pulled their shawls tighter. He'd come back from the war different, they said, marked by something darker than just the trenches in France. His face was a ruin of twisted flesh and angry ridges, they claimed, and his temper burned hotter than the forge fire. Some swore they'd seen him tear a man's arm clean off for stealing from his traps. Others spoke of midnight screams that echoed down from his cabin when the moon was dark. Elena had listened to these tales with growing dread, because Cedar Ridge was exactly where Marcus Holloway would expect her to run. The terrain was brutal, the hiding places few, and if the stories were true, she'd be trading one monster for another. But Marcus had connections in every city from here to Atlanta, eyes and ears that would find her eventually if she stayed in civilized places. The mountains, dangerous as they were, might be her only chance. Now, as pale golden light began to filter through the pine needles and the forest stirred to life around her, Elena made herself as small as possible behind her tree and watched the narrow trail that wound up toward the hidden cabin. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, but she didn't dare move. Not yet, not until she knew what kind of man she was dealing with. The sound came first, so soft she almost missed it beneath the whisper of wind through leaves. Footsteps measured and careful, descending the mountain path with the quiet confidence of someone who knew every root and stone. Elena's breath caught in her throat as a figure emerged from the morning shadows, and despite everything she'd heard, despite every terrifying tale that had driven sleep from her nights, she found herself staring not at a monster but at something far more unsettling. A man who moved through the wilderness like he belonged to it. Thomas Wade was tall, broader through the shoulders than any man she'd known, his frame carrying the kind of strength that came from years of splitting wood and hauling timber. His clothes were simple but well mended, dark wool pants and a cotton shirt rolled up at the sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle. His hair was brown and slightly overgrown, catching the morning light in ways that spoke of health and vitality. But it was his face that made Elena's heart stop, because the stories had been both completely wrong and somehow not wrong enough. Yes, there were scars. A network of them ran along the left side of his jaw and up toward his temple, pale lines that spoke of old pain and careful healing. But they weren't the grotesque ruins the townsfolk had described. They were simply marks, the way a tree might bear scars from lightning yet continue to grow strong and tall. And his eyes, visible even from her hiding place, weren't the wild, violent orbs she'd imagined. They were brown and steady, the kind of eyes that saw everything and judged quietly. What made Elena's breath catch wasn't fear, it was the complete absence of the menace she'd been promised. Thomas Wade moved with the quiet grace of someone at peace with his world, and in his hands, he carried something that made no sense at all given everything she'd been told. Wildflowers. A carefully gathered bundle of mountain laurel, wild columbine, and delicate wood sorrel, their petals still heavy with dew. He held them with the same care most men reserve for precious metals or family Bibles, and as Elena watched from her hiding place, he paused at a bend in the trail to add a few more stems to his collection. Tiny bluebells that grew in the shade of a massive boulder. The sight was so far from what she'd expected that for a moment Elena forgot her fear entirely. This was the devil of Cedar Ridge, this man who stopped his morning walk to gather flowers with the patience of someone arranging a Sunday church bouquet. She watched, transfixed, as he continued down the path, his steps sure and unhurried, the wildflowers cradled against his chest like something infinitely valuable. But Elena's moment of wonder shattered when her empty stomach chose that precise instant to let out a growl so loud it might as well have been a dinner bell. The sound cut through the morning stillness like a blade, and Thomas Wade stopped as if he'd been struck. His head turned toward her hiding place with the swift, sure movement of a man accustomed to listening for danger in wild places. For several heartbeats, neither of them moved. Elena pressed herself harder against the oak's rough bark, praying the shadows would swallow her, while Thomas stood motionless on the trail, his eyes scanning the forest with quiet intensity. Then, in a voice that carried none of the harsh growl she'd expected, he spoke. "Morning's mighty cold to be sleeping rough in the woods," he said, his words pitched to carry without seeming threatening. Most folks would have made themselves known by now, maybe asked for directions back to town. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. He knew she was there, had probably known since before she'd seen him. The question was what he intended to do about it. Every story she'd heard screamed at her to run, to take her chances with the forest rather than face whatever violence he might bring. But her legs felt like water, and besides, where could she go? He knew these mountains like scripture while she could barely find her way back to the main road. "I'm not looking for trouble," she called out, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "Just passing through." A long pause settled between them, filled with the soft sounds of morning birds and the distant whisper of running water. When Thomas spoke again, there was something different in his tone. Not softer, exactly, but more careful. "Passing through to where?" he asked. "Next settlement's 2 days' walk east, and the weather's fixing to turn. Radio said rain coming in heavy tonight." Elena closed her eyes. She'd known this moment would come eventually, the moment when she'd have to trust someone or die alone in the wilderness. She just hoped it would be someone whose reputation didn't include dismembering thieves and howling at the moon. "I don't rightly know where I'm headed," she admitted, stepping out from behind the oak with her hands visible and empty. "Just away from where I've been." The first thing she noticed when she finally saw Thomas Wade clearly was how young he looked. The scars and the stories had built him up in her mind as some ancient mountain demon, but he couldn't have been much older than 30. The second thing she noticed was that he didn't look surprised to see her, as if lost women emerged from behind trees on his morning walks with some regularity. The third thing she noticed was that he was looking at her with something she hadn't seen in a long time. Simple human concern, free of judgment or calculation.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"You're hurt," he said, and it wasn't a question. His eyes had found the torn fabric at her knee where she'd fallen climbing over a stone wall, the scratches on her hands from brambles, the exhaustion that hung around her like a worn-out coat. "It's nothing," Elena said quickly, though even as the words left her mouth she swayed slightly on her feet. 3 days of running on perhaps 6 hours of sleep and 2 real meals would take the starch out of anyone. Thomas studied her for another long moment, then made a decision that would have seemed impossible based on everything she'd been told about him. He sat down on a fallen log beside the trail, set his bundle of wildflowers carefully next to him, and began unlacing one of his boots. "What are you doing?" Elena asked, alarmed despite herself. "You can't walk much further in those city shoes," he said, matter-of-factly pulling off his boot, and then the thick wool sock underneath. "Ground's only going to get rougher from here, and like I said, rain's coming." He held out the sock to her, and Elena stared at it like he was offering her a live snake. "I can't take your sock," she said. "You can and you will," Thomas replied, but there was no harshness in it. "Wrap it around that foot where the leather's worn through. Won't solve the problem, but it'll get you somewhere safer than this." Elena looked down at her ruined shoes, then back at this strange man who gathered flowers at dawn and offered clothing to desperate strangers. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, that the kindness was just bait before the violence everyone had promised would come. But the alternative was continuing to stumble through the mountains until she collapsed, or Marcus Holloway's men found her trail. She took the sock. The wool was warm from his body heat, and softer than anything she'd felt in days. As she wrapped it carefully around her damaged foot, Thomas put his boot back on and stood, collecting his wildflowers with the same careful attention he'd shown before. "There's a cabin about half a mile up the ridge," he said, nodding toward a path that was barely visible through the trees. "It's mine, but there's a shed out back with walls and a roof. You can rest there till you figure out where you're headed next." Elena finished tying the sock and looked up at him, confusion and wariness warring in her chest. "Why would you do that?" Thomas Wade was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as if seeing something beyond the immediate forest around them. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that spoke of old pain carefully managed. "Because once upon a time, I was lost too," he said, "and someone helped me find my way back. Seemed like the decent thing to pass it along." He turned to go, then paused and looked back at her. "Name's Thomas Wade," he said. "Most folks call me Tom. That shed's got blankets, and there's a well nearby for water. I'll leave some food by the door come evening, but I won't bother you. You can stay as long as you need to get your strength back." And with that he walked away up the mountain path, leaving Elena standing in the morning light with a stranger's sock on her foot, and the complete upending of everything she'd thought she knew about Cedar Ridge, and the scarred devil who lived there. She stood motionless for several minutes after he disappeared, listening to the forest wake up around her, and trying to process what had just happened. The man she'd been taught to fear had treated her with more genuine kindness than anyone had shown her in months. He'd given her shelter, asked no questions, and demanded nothing in return except perhaps the common decency to pass such kindness along when her own opportunity came. Elena looked down at the wildflowers he'd dropped when he sat to give her his sock. They lay scattered on the forest floor, their petals catching the strengthening sunlight like tiny stained glass windows. Without quite understanding why, she gathered them up, holding them as carefully as she'd seen him do. By the time she found the cabin and the shed he'd mentioned, the sun was fully up and the morning was warming into what promised to be a beautiful day. The shed was exactly as advertised, simple but clean, with thick walls and a solid roof. There were blankets neatly folded on a wooden crate, and outside she found the promised well, its water cold and sweet. For the first time in 3 days, Elena allowed herself to truly rest. She drank deeply from the well, wrapped herself in the clean blankets, and settled into a corner where she could see both the shed door and the path leading back down the mountain. And as she finally let exhaustion take her, she found herself thinking not about Marcus Holloway or the danger she'd fled, but about a scarred mountain man who gathered wildflowers at dawn, and gave his socks to strangers. When she woke, the sun was setting and there was a cloth bundle by the shed door, just as he'd promised. Inside she found bread, cheese, dried meat, and a jar of what looked like honey. There was also a small piece of paper, and on it, written in careful script, were just a few words. "Tomorrow's supposed to be fair weather. The flowers bloom best after sunrise." Elena ate the simple meal slowly, savoring every bite, and as full darkness settled over the mountains, she found herself listening, not for sounds of danger but for something else entirely. Somewhere up the ridge, Thomas Wade was settling into his own evening, and for the first time since she'd fled Charlotte, Elena Brooks felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: safe. Elena woke before dawn to the sound of footsteps on gravel, so light they might have been imagined, if not for the soft crunch of leather on stone. Through the gap in the shed door, she glimpsed a figure moving past in the gray pre-dawn light, heading toward what she now knew was Sunrise Meadow. Her borrowed sock had kept her foot comfortable through the night, and the food Tom had left had restored strength she hadn't realized she'd lost. But it was curiosity more than hunger that drew her quietly from the shed, and onto the faint trail that wound upward through the pines. She followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows between trees, telling herself she needed to understand this man who'd shown her such unexpected mercy. The path climbed steadily, winding through groves of mountain laurel, and past granite outcroppings that caught the first pale hints of sunrise. The air smelled of pine resin and wild honeysuckle, clean and sharp in a way that made her lungs feel renewed after months of Charlotte's coal smoke and dust. When the trees opened into a natural meadow, Elena pressed herself behind a massive poplar and watched Thomas Wade perform what could only be described as a ritual. He moved through the wildflowers with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral, his hands gentle as he selected each bloom. Wild bergamot with its crown of purple petals, delicate pink lady slippers that grew in the shade of larger plants, clusters of golden ragwort that caught the strengthening light like small suns. He worked methodically but never carelessly, taking only what the meadow could spare, and leaving the root systems undisturbed. The strangest part wasn't the gathering itself, but the care with which he arranged each stem. Tom would hold a flower up to the light, turn it this way and that, then either add it to his growing bundle, or set it gently back where he'd found it. It reminded Elena of her grandmother selecting fabric for quilting, the same patient evaluation of color and texture, and how each piece would contribute to the greater whole. But wildflowers weren't quilt squares, and she couldn't fathom what purpose drove such meticulous attention to what most people would consider weeds. As the sun crested the eastern peaks and sent long golden shafts across the meadow, Tom stood and surveyed his work. His bundle was smaller than yesterday's but somehow more intentional, each flower seeming to complement the others in ways that spoke of genuine artistry. He tucked the stems carefully inside his shirt to protect them from the morning breeze, then began the walk back down the mountain. Elena waited until he disappeared into the trees before emerging from her hiding place. The meadow in full morning light was breathtaking, a carpet of color that stretched from the pine forest to the rocky ridge beyond. She could see where Tom had selected his flowers, but the meadow looked untouched, as if he'd borrowed rather than taken. Wild bees hummed among the remaining blooms, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird ran through its repertoire of stolen songs. She made her way back to the shed by a different route, arriving well before Tom would return to the cabin. But as she settled back into her blankets and pretended to sleep, Elena found herself thinking about the expression she'd seen on his face in the meadow. It hadn't been the look of someone performing a chore or even following a pleasant habit. It had been the look of someone fulfilling a sacred obligation, and she couldn't shake the feeling that those flowers were destined for something far more important than simple decoration. The answer came 3 hours later when she woke to find Tom placing something on the ground just outside the shed door. She watched through half-closed eyes as he arranged the wild flowers he'd gathered into a perfect circle, each stem positioned with the same care she'd witnessed in the meadow. But that wasn't the surprising part. The surprising part was what he placed in the center of that floral circle. A pillow, small and simply made, covered in what looked like hand-sewn cotton ticking. He positioned it with infinite gentleness, adjusting the wild flowers around its edges, until the arrangement satisfied whatever vision he carried in his mind. Then he stood, brushed the dirt from his hands, and walked away without making a sound. Elena lay still for long minutes after his footsteps faded, staring at the impossible sight outside her door. The stories had painted Thomas Wade as a violent man, someone to be feared and avoided. But violent men didn't spend their mornings creating beauty for strangers. They didn't gather wildflowers with the patience of saints, or leave pillows circled with mountain laurel for women who'd done nothing to earn such kindness. When she finally emerged from the shed, Elena knelt beside the arrangement as if approaching an altar. The pillow was soft beneath her fingers, stuffed with what felt like pine needles, and some kind of dried grass that released a faint herbal scent when compressed. The wild flowers were already beginning to respond to the warmth, their petals opening fully in the strengthening sun. Pink lady slippers nodded beside purple bergamot, while golden ragwort provided bright accents that made the entire circle seem to glow with its own light. She lifted the pillow carefully, half expecting it to dissolve like something from a dream. But it was real and solid, and smelled of the clean mountain air. As she held it, Elena noticed something embroidered on one corner in thread, so fine it was nearly invisible. Letters, stitched with the same meticulous care Tom brought to everything else. Her breath caught as she made out the words, "For peaceful rest." That night, Elena slept with her head on Thomas Wade's gift, surrounded by the fading fragrance of wild bergamot and the distant sound of water running over stones. She slept more deeply than she had since fleeing Charlotte, her dreams filled not with Marcus Holloway's threats, or the sound of pursuing footsteps, but with meadows full of wildflowers, and the steady presence of someone who asked nothing but offered everything. When she woke the next morning, the flowers had been replaced, fresh ones, arranged in the same careful circle, their petals heavy with dew. Tom had come and gone in the darkness, silent as moonlight, leaving this small daily miracle for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. The pattern continued for days. Each dawn brought the soft sound of footsteps on gravel, followed by the quiet ritual of flower arrangement. Tom never lingered, never tried to speak with her, never intruded on the space he'd given her for healing. But every morning Elena woke to find a new circle of wildflowers, each arrangement unique and beautiful, surrounding the pillow that had become her most treasured possession. On the fourth morning, she decided to follow him again, not to spy this time but to understand. The questions had been building in her mind like pressure behind a dam. Why wildflowers? Why the pillow? Why such care for a stranger who'd brought nothing but trouble to his peaceful mountain existence? She'd learned his route by now and reached the meadow before him, concealing herself behind a different tree with a better view of the entire space. When Tom arrived, Elena noticed something she'd missed before. He wasn't just gathering flowers randomly. He was visiting specific spots, places where the light fell in particular ways, or where certain combinations of blooms grew together. And at each location, he paused not just to select flowers but to do something else. He was talking to them. Elena strained to hear the words, but Tom kept his voice low, little more than a whisper that blended with the morning breeze. She caught fragments, phrases that seemed to be addressed to the flowers themselves rather than to any human listener. "Need you to be extra pretty today," she heard. And later, "She's been having bad dreams, I think." Something gentle for her pillow. The realization hit Elena like a physical blow. He wasn't just gathering wildflowers for their beauty. He was selecting them specifically for her, choosing each bloom based on what he imagined she might need for comfort. The man who supposedly tore thieves limb from limb was spending his mornings in conversation with mountain laurel, asking flowers to help soothe a stranger's troubled sleep. She watched him complete his gathering and begin the walk back toward the cabin, but this time Elena didn't follow immediately. She remained in the meadow, trying to reconcile everything she'd been told about Thomas Wade with everything she'd witnessed. The disconnect was so complete, it made her question, not just the stories, but her own ability to judge character. How had an entire township gotten one man so completely wrong? When she finally returned to the shed, Tom had already completed his morning ritual. But today the arrangement was different. Along with the usual wildflowers, he'd added something new. Nestled among the pink lady slippers and golden ragwort were several stems of wild mint, their leaves releasing a cool, clean scent when touched by the morning breeze. Elena lifted the pillow and found that it too had been enhanced. The herb scent was stronger now, more complex, as if Tom had refreshed the stuffing with new materials chosen specifically for their calming properties. That evening, for the first time since arriving at Cedar Ridge, Elena left the safety of the shed and walked to the cabin's front door. She didn't knock, didn't call out, just stood on the rough-hewn porch and listened to the sounds from inside. The scrape of a chair on wood floors, the soft thunk of a book being closed, the whisper of sock feet moving across the room. Normal sounds, the kind that spoke of solitary comfort, rather than violent isolation. After several minutes, the door opened, and Tom appeared in the lamplight. He didn't seem surprised to see her,
though his expression was carefully neutral, as if he understood this moment required delicate handling. "Evening," he said quietly. "Everything all right with the shed?" Elena looked at his face in the golden light spilling from inside the cabin. The scars were more visible here, pale lines that told stories of old pain. But they didn't make him monstrous. If anything, they made him more human. A man who'd survived something terrible, and chosen gentleness afterward. "Why do you do it?" she asked. "The flowers, the pillow, all of it. You don't know me, don't owe me anything. Why?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, his brown eyes studying her face as if trying to determine how much truth she could handle. Finally, he stepped aside and nodded toward the interior of the cabin. "Might be easier to explain sitting down," he said. "Coffee's still warm if you want some." Elena hesitated on the threshold. Years of warnings
about trusting strange men warring with everything she'd observed about Thomas Wade's character. But the coffee smelled wonderful, and she was tired of being afraid. She stepped inside. The cabin's interior was nothing like she'd expected. Clean and orderly, yes, but more than that, it was clearly the home of someone who found peace in simple beauty. Hand-carved wooden bowls sat on open shelves, their surfaces worn smooth by years of use. A quilt stretched across the single bed, its pattern complex but soothing, all earth tones and gentle curves. Books lined one wall, their spines showing titles on everything from farming techniques to poetry. And everywhere, in small glasses and tin cups, were wildflowers. Not the elaborate arrangements he created for her pillow, but simple bouquets that brightened every surface. Mountain laurel on the mantel, wild columbine on the table, tiny bluebells clustered on the windowsill. The cabin felt alive with growing things, as if Tom had found a way to bring the meadow indoors without taming it. He poured coffee into 2 chipped ceramic mugs and gestured for Elena to sit in the cabin's single chair while he settled on a 3-legged stool near the fireplace. The coffee was strong and bitter, but warming, and Elena found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation. "The flowers started during the war," Tom said finally, his voice low and thoughtful. "France, 1918. I was a medic with the 30th Infantry, and we'd been in the trenches for weeks without seeing anything green or growing. Just mud and wire, and things I don't like to remember." He paused to sip his coffee, his eyes distant with memory. "There was a girl in one of the field hospitals, French, couldn't have been more than 16. She'd lost her whole family when the Germans came through her village, and she hadn't spoken a word since. The other nurses thought she might never speak again. But every morning if there were any wildflowers left in the countryside, she'd gather them up and put them by the beds of the worst cases. Men who were dying, men who were too broken to fix, she'd make sure they had something beautiful to look at." Elena set down her mug, understanding beginning to dawn. "She saved my life twice," Tom continued. "Once when shrapnel tore up my face and I wanted to die rather than live with the scars. She sat by my bed for hours, showing me flowers and telling me their names in French, making me understand that broken things could still be beautiful. And once more when I got home and found out what folks thought these scars meant about who I was inside." "The stories about you," Elena said softly, "they're not true, are they?" Tom's smile was sad but not bitter. "People see scars and they make assumptions. A man comes back from war marked up like I am, they figure the violence followed him home. And I was angry for a while, angry enough that I didn't much care what people thought. But then I remembered Marie, that was the girl's name, and how she'd used flowers to remind people that beauty could grow anywhere, even in the worst places. So you started gathering them," Elena said, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "Started with just bringing them indoors, like you see here. But then I remembered something else Marie used to do. She'd make little pillows stuffed with herbs and flowers, said they helped with nightmares and bad sleep. After what I'd been through, I figured I could use all the peaceful rest I could get." Tom stood and walked to a wooden chest near the window. From it, he pulled out a pillow similar to the one he'd given Elena, though more worn and faded. "Made this one for myself," he said, holding it carefully. learned by trial and error what combinations worked best, which flowers kept their scent longest, how to dry the herbs so they'd stay effective. And it helped, more than I thought it would. But why me? Elena asked. Why go to all that trouble for a stranger? Tom returned to his stool, the worn pillow still in his hands. Because when I saw you hiding behind that tree, hungry and scared, and trying so hard to be invisible, you reminded me of Marie. Not how she looked, but how she carried herself, like someone who'd seen too much, and was still trying to figure out how to keep living. He met Elena's eyes directly, and she saw no pity there, only recognition. And because, he continued, someone once told me that kindness isn't something you do because people deserve it. It's something you do because it's who you choose to be. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself to shed since fleeing Charlotte. Not tears of sadness or fear, but of something deeper and more complicated. Relief, perhaps, at finding genuine human decency in a place where she'd expected only danger. Or gratitude for being seen as someone worth protecting rather than someone to be used or discarded. I don't know if I can stay, she said finally. There are people looking for me, people who might bring trouble to anyone who helps me. Tom nodded as if he'd expected this. Figured as much, he said. Woman doesn't sleep rough in the mountains, and jump at every sound unless she's running from something serious. But running only works if you've got somewhere to run to. And you strike me as someone who's been moving without much direction. Elena couldn't argue with that assessment. She'd fled Charlotte with no plan beyond getting as far away from Marcus Holloway as possible, and she'd been improvising ever since. What I'm thinking, Tom continued, is that maybe you could use some time to figure out your next move. And maybe I could use some company that doesn't involve walking to town and listening to folks whisper about how I've probably got bodies buried in my garden. Despite everything, Elena found herself smiling. You want me to stay? She asked. I want you to have the choice, Tom corrected gently. Stay and help me tend the flowers, help me understand which arrangements work best for peaceful sleep, or rest up for a few more days, and let me point you toward a town where nobody knows your face or your story. Either way, you'll have done it because you wanted to, not because you were forced. Elena looked around the cabin again, taking in the simple comfort Tom had created for himself, the evidence of a man who'd found ways to build beauty from the wreckage of war and isolation. Outside, night was settling over the mountains, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called through the darkness. For the first time in months, Elena felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Not just safety, though Tom's presence provided that. Not just kindness, though he'd shown her more than anyone in recent memory. What she felt was possibility, the sense that her story didn't have to end with running and hiding and eventually being caught. I'd like to learn about the flowers, she said quietly. About making the pillows, about which herbs work best for nightmares. I'd like to understand how you turned something people feared into something that brings comfort. Tom's smile was the first truly happy expression she'd seen from him, transforming his scarred face into something that could only be called beautiful. We'll start tomorrow, he said. Dawn comes early in the mountains, but I've got a feeling you're already used to early mornings. As Elena walked back to the shed that night, her pillow tucked carefully under her arm, she realized that Thomas Wade had given her something more valuable than shelter or food or even safety. He'd given her a different way to see herself, not as a victim running from inevitable capture, but as someone capable of learning new skills and building new kinds of strength. The wildflowers around her pillow had changed again, while she'd been in the cabin, she noticed. Tonight they included white trillium and wild ginger, flowers she hadn't seen in previous arrangements. As she settled into her blankets and breathed in their subtle fragrance, Elena wondered if Tom had chosen them specifically for this conversation, if he'd somehow known she'd need flowers that spoke of new beginnings rather than simple comfort. It didn't matter, she decided as sleep began to claim her. What mattered was that for the first time since leaving Charlotte, she was looking forward to tomorrow instead of dreading it. And somewhere up the ridge, Thomas Wade was probably doing the same thing, planning the next day's flower gathering.
and thinking about the lessons he'd share with someone who'd asked to learn rather than demanded to be saved. The mountains settled into their nightly quiet around them both, and in the darkness, wildflowers bloomed unseen, preparing for tomorrow's careful harvest. The education began before sunrise, as Elena had expected it would. She woke to the sound of Tom's footsteps on the gravel path, but this morning he paused outside the shed and spoke her name softly into the darkness. "Elena, you still wanting to learn about the flowers?" She emerged from her blankets already dressed, having anticipated this moment since their conversation the night before. Tom waited patiently while she folded her bedding and secured the precious pillow in her arms, then gestured for her to follow him up the mountain path. "First thing to understand," he said as they climbed through the pre-dawn darkness, "is that not all flowers are the same, even if they look similar. What matters isn't just how pretty they are, but what they carry inside. Some flowers hold scents that calm the mind, others that sharpen it. Some fade quick, others keep their strength for weeks." The path was steeper than Elena had realized during her secret observations, winding through stands of pine and oak that seemed to press closer in the darkness. But Tom moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who could navigate these trails blindfolded, and his steady presence made her feel secure despite the challenging terrain. "Marie, the girl I told you about," Tom continued as they walked, "she taught me that flowers aren't just decorations. They're medicine, in their way. Not the kind that cures fevers or mends bones, but the kind that heals the parts of people that doctors can't touch." They reached Sunrise Meadow just as the eastern sky began to show the first pale hints of dawn. In the gray half-light, the wildflowers looked different than they had during Elena's spying missions. Less like a chaotic carpet of color and more like a carefully orchestrated symphony waiting for the conductor's baton. "See how they're arranged?" Tom asked, pointing to what Elena had assumed was random growth. "Nature's got patterns, but they're not always obvious. The tall flowers protect the shorter ones from wind, the shade lovers cluster near the big plants, everything finding its place based on what it needs to thrive." As the light strengthened, Elena began to see what he meant. What had looked like random wildness revealed itself as an intricate ecosystem, each plant contributing to the whole in ways that weren't immediately apparent but became clear once you learned to look properly. "Lady slippers," Tom said, kneeling beside a cluster of pink blooms. "They're particular about where they grow. Need just the right amount of shade, just the right kind of soil. But when you find them in the perfect spot, they'll come back year after year, getting stronger each season." He demonstrated the proper way to harvest them, taking only mature blooms and leaving the root system undisturbed. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but also with a tenderness that spoke of genuine respect for the living things he was gathering. "The secret," he explained, as Elena tried to copy his technique, "is taking only what's freely given. Force a flower that's not ready, and it'll wilt before you get it home. But wait for the right moment, ask permission instead of demanding, and you'll have blooms that keep their beauty for days." Elena's first attempts were clumsy, her city-soft hands uncertain with the delicate stems. But Tom was patient, guiding her fingers to the right places, showing her how to feel for the perfect moment when a flower was ready to be picked. Gradually, she began to develop a sense for it, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated which blooms would thrive in arrangements, and which needed more time to mature. "Wild bergamot," Tom said, moving to a different section of the meadow where purple flowers clustered in dense stands. "This one's good for pillows because the scent stays strong even when dried. But you've got to harvest it early in the morning, when the oils are concentrated in the petals." Elena knelt beside him, breathing in the herb's complex fragrance. It was stronger than she'd expected, almost medicinal in its intensity, but not unpleasant. As she worked to gather stems using the technique Tom had shown her, she found herself thinking about the pillow that had become her most treasured possession. "How do you decide what goes in each pillow?" she asked. "How do you know which flowers will work together?" Tom paused in his harvesting, considering the question. "Part of it's practical," he said finally. "Some flowers complement each other's scents, Others clash in ways that'll give you a headache instead of helping you sleep. But part of it's more intuitive. You learn to read people, figure out what kind of healing they need most. What did you read in me? Elena asked, curious about what had prompted his specific choices for her pillow. Tom's expression grew thoughtful as he studied her face in the growing daylight. Fear, he said simply, but not the sharp kind that comes from immediate danger. The deep kind that settles into your bones after you've been hurt, and don't know if you can trust anyone again. That's why I used pine needles in the stuffing instead of just cotton. Pine's got a clean scent that cuts through anxiety, helps quiet the mind when it's racing with worry. Elena touched the pillow she'd carried with her, understanding flooding through her. The herbal scent that had seemed simply pleasant was actually carefully chosen medicine, selected specifically to address the kinds of sleepless nights she'd been enduring. The wild mint I added later, Tom continued. That's for when nightmares are the problem. Mint's cooling, helps break fever dreams and the kind of sweating that comes with bad memories. They worked together through the strengthening morning light, Tom teaching Elena to identify different flowers by their scents, their growing patterns, the subtle variations that distinguished beneficial plants from their less useful cousins. Wild ginger with its heart-shaped leaves and distinctive rhizomes, white trillium, that required careful handling to avoid damaging its three-petaled blooms, golden ragwort that grew in sunny patches, and carried a scent like honey and green grass. Each flower's got its own personality, Tom explained as they moved through the meadow. Some are generous, blooming long and giving their scent freely. Others are more reserved, keeping their best qualities hidden until you know how to coax them out. Learning to work with flowers is like learning to work with people. You've got to respect what they are, instead of demanding what you want them to be. By the time the sun was fully up, Elena's arms were full of carefully selected blooms, and her understanding of Tom's morning ritual had deepened considerably. This wasn't the simple flower gathering she'd imagined from her hiding place behind the trees. It was a complex practice that combined botanical knowledge, artistic sensibility, and something that could only be called healing intuition. Now comes the hard part, Tom said as they prepared to leave the meadow. Getting them home before they start to wilt, and then processing them in ways that preserve what makes them special. The walk back to the cabin was slower than their upward journey, both of them carrying armloads of flowers that needed careful handling. Tom showed Elena how to hold the stems to avoid crushing them, how to arrange the blooms so air could circulate around the petals, how to read the early signs of wilting that meant immediate attention was required. At the cabin, Elena expected Tom to begin creating the arrangement for her pillow, but instead he led her to a workspace she hadn't noticed before. Behind the main building, sheltered by overhanging eaves but open to air circulation, was what could only be described as a flower workshop. Wooden drying racks lined one wall, their shelves holding bundles of herbs in various stages of preservation. Work tables provided space for sorting and arranging, while glass jars and tin containers held what appeared to be a comprehensive collection of dried materials. This is where the real work happens, Tom said, setting his gathered flowers on one of the tables. Fresh blooms are beautiful, but they don't last. If you want to make something that'll provide comfort for weeks or months, you've got to understand preservation. Elena watched, fascinated, as Tom began sorting their morning's harvest. Some flowers went immediately into arrangements for fresh use. Others were prepared for drying by having their lower leaves removed and their stems trimmed to precise lengths. Still others were set aside for more complex processing that involved techniques Elena couldn't even identify. Pine needles, Tom said, pointing to bundles hanging from the rafters. They need to dry slowly to keep their oils. Rush the process and you lose the scent that makes them useful. But lavender, that you can dry quick in direct sun, concentrates the fragrance instead of dissipating it. He showed Elena how to prepare flowers for drying, demonstrating the different techniques required for different types of blooms. Some were hung in bundles with their stems up, others were laid flat on screens, still others were processed immediately while fresh. Each method was designed to preserve specific qualities that would contribute to the final pillow filling. The art, Tom explained as they worked, is in the blending. You can't just throw dried flowers together and expect them to work. Some scents are too strong and will overpower everything else. Others are too subtle and get lost unless you use them in the right proportions. Elena found herself thinking of her grandmother's cooking, how certain spices had to be added at specific times to achieve the right flavor balance. This felt similar, but instead of creating taste, Tom was creating something that would influence dreams and sleep, and the subtle ways the mind processed rest. "What about my pillow?" she asked. "What went into that?" Tom moved to a different set of jars, selecting various dried materials as he spoke. Base of pine needles for the clean scent and the way they hold their shape. Mountain mint for cooling and nightmare prevention. A little wild bergamot for depth, but not too much or it gets overwhelming. White trillium petals for softness, dried properly, so they keep some flexibility. He measured each ingredient carefully, his hands moving with the precision of someone who'd done this countless times but never carelessly. And then he said, adding a small amount of something Elena couldn't identify. "Dried lavender from a patch I cultivate behind the cabin. Just a pinch, because too much lavender can actually cause restless sleep instead of preventing it." Elena watched him blend the materials, his fingers working them together until they formed a mixture that looked almost like exotic potpourri. But when she breathed in the combined scent, she understood that this was something far more sophisticated than simple decoration. The fragrance was complex but harmonious, calming without being overwhelming, strong enough to influence sleep, but subtle enough not to intrude on dreams. "Try it," Tom said, holding out a handful of the mixture. "See if you can identify the individual components." Elena closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. The pine came through first clean and sharp, followed by the cooling mint and the deeper, more complex notes of the bergamot. Underneath those primary scents were subtler layers, the soft sweetness of trillium petals, and the classic lavender that tied everything together. "It's like music," she said, opening her eyes. "Each scent has its own note, but together they create something more complex." Tom's smile was the kind reserved for students who'd grasped a concept that couldn't be taught through words alone. "That's exactly right," he said. "And just like music, if one element is out of balance, the whole composition suffers." They spent the rest of the morning processing flowers, Elena learning techniques that had clearly been developed through years of experimentation and refinement. Tom showed her how to test drying progress by checking the flexibility of stems, how to store processed materials to maintain their potency, how to identify when herbs had been dried too long and lost their effectiveness. But more than the technical knowledge, Elena was absorbing something harder to define. Tom's approach to working with flowers wasn't just methodical, it was reverent. He handled each bloom as if it were precious, wasted nothing that could be useful, and approached every stage of the process with the kind of attention that spoke of genuine love for the craft. "Why don't more people know about this?" Elena asked as they broke for a simple lunch of bread and cheese. "Why aren't there others doing what you do?" Tom was quiet for a moment, looking out toward the meadow where they'd gathered their morning's harvest. "Takes time to learn it properly," he said finally. "Most folks nowadays want quick fixes, medicines that work fast and don't require understanding. But this kind of healing, it's slow work. You've got to pay attention to seasons, learn to read what people really need instead of what they think they want." He paused, then continued more quietly. "And it takes a certain kind of life to develop the knowledge. You've got to be still enough to notice how different flowers affect sleep, patient enough to experiment with blending until you get it right. Most people are too busy to sit with that kind of learning." Elena understood what he wasn't saying directly. The isolation that had driven Tom to the mountains, the way his scars had separated him from normal social connections, had also given him the solitude necessary to develop this unusual expertise. His exile from ordinary community had become the foundation for a different kind of service, one that few people even knew existed. That afternoon, Tom taught Elena to construct a pillow from scratch. The outer covering was simple cotton ticking, sewn with careful seams that would contain the filling without allowing any to escape. But the real skill lay in achieving the right density of stuffing, firm enough to provide support but soft enough to be comfortable. With the herbal mixture distributed evenly throughout, too loose and the herbs will settle to one end, Tom explained as Elena practiced the technique. Too tight, and the scents can't circulate properly. You want something that'll hold its shape but still breathe. Elena's first attempt was lumpy and uneven, the filling clumped in some areas, while other sections remained nearly empty. But Tom guided her through the process patiently, showing her how to work the mixture with her fingers until it distributed evenly, how to test the firmness by pressing different areas, how to seal the final seam so it would hold indefinitely. Her second pillow was better, more uniform in its stuffing, and more professional in its appearance. When she held it up to her nose and breathed in, the scent was clean and complex, promising the kind of peaceful sleep she'd experienced since Tom began his flower ritual. "This one's yours to keep," Tom said. "Practice pillow, you might say. Try it out, see how it affects your rest, and we'll adjust the mixture based on what you learn." Elena cradled the pillow carefully, understanding that she held much more than a simple sleeping aid. This was evidence of skill learned, of trust shared, of the possibility that she could become someone who created comfort instead of merely receiving it. As evening approached and they prepared to return the workshop to order, Elena found herself thinking about the stories she'd heard in Pine Creek Township. The violent mountain man who tore thieves apart, who howled at the moon and threatened anyone who dared approach his territory. How had such tales
grown up around someone whose actual occupation seemed to involve therapeutic flower arrangement and artisanal pillow construction? "Tom," she said, as they secured the drying herbs against the night air, "why do people in town tell such terrible stories about you? Why do they think you're dangerous?" Tom's hands stilled on the bundle he was adjusting. For a long moment, he was quiet, and Elena wondered if she'd overstepped some boundary. "People tell stories to explain things they don't understand," he said finally. "Man comes back from war with a torn-up face, keeps to himself in the mountains, doesn't come to town except for supplies. That's enough to build mysteries around, and mysteries make folks nervous." He finished securing the herbs and turned to face her directly. "There was an incident, couple years back. Man named Crawford thought I was hiding something valuable up here, came prowling around my property at night. When I caught him trying to break into the cabin, he got scared and came at me." Elena watched Tom's expression change as he continued his story, the comfortable ease of their afternoon workshop replaced by something more guarded and distant. His hands stilled on the bundle of herbs he was securing, and she could see the effort it took for him to continue speaking. "Crawford was drunk when he came up here," Tom said quietly. "Drunk and convinced I had gold or silver stashed away somewhere. When I found him trying to pry the door off my cabin, I told him to leave peaceable-like. But he had other ideas." Tom turned away from her, focusing his attention on adjusting the position of the drying racks with unnecessary precision. Elena waited, sensing that this story needed to emerge at its own pace, without pressure or prodding. "He came at me with a knife," Tom continued, his voice level but carrying undertones of old pain. "Not a big one, just a folding blade, but sharp enough to do damage. I defended myself the way they taught us in the army, quick and decisive." Elena felt a chill settle over her as she began to understand what kind of incident had transformed Tom's reputation from merely reclusive to actively dangerous. "I didn't mean to hurt him as bad as I did," Tom said, finally turning back to meet her eyes. "But when someone comes at you with a blade in the dark, you don't have time for gentle measures. Crawford ended up with a broken arm and some bruised ribs. Nothing that wouldn't heal, but enough to send him running back to town with a story about the crazy mountain man who attacked him for no reason. But he was the one with the knife," Elena protested. "He was breaking into your home." Tom's smile was grim and knowing. "Crawford's got family in Pine Creek. Important family," people with money and influence. Me, I'm just a scarred-up veteran who keeps to himself. When it came down to his word against mine, which version do you think folks were inclined to believe? Elena felt anger rising in her chest, not at Tom but at the casual injustice of a system that would believe a drunken thief over an honest man, simply because one had better connections than the other. It was a pattern she recognized from her own recent experiences, the way power and influence could reshape truth to serve convenient narratives. The story got bigger with each telling. Tom continued, returning to his work organizing the herbal materials. Started with me breaking Crawford's arm, grew into me threatening to kill him, then became me actually trying to kill him. By the time it had made the rounds through town a few times, I was some kind of monster who attacked innocent visitors and probably had bodies buried all over the mountain. And you never tried to correct it? Elena asked. Never went to town to tell your side? Tom shook his head, his expression resigned rather than bitter. What would have been the point? People believe what they want to believe, especially when the alternative means admitting they might have been wrong about someone. Besides, the stories served a purpose. They kept troublemakers away, let me live in peace without having to worry about other Crawfords coming around looking for easy money. Elena understood the logic, but it still struck her as profoundly unfair. Tom had created something beautiful and healing in his mountain sanctuary, had developed skills that could genuinely help people, and instead of being recognized for those contributions, he'd been turned into a local boogeyman. Doesn't it bother you, she asked, being seen as something you're not? Tom considered the question as he moved around the workshop, checking that everything was properly secured for the night. Used to, he admitted. Right after I got back from France, when the scars were fresh and I was still trying to figure out how to live with them, it hurt something fierce to see the way people looked at me, like I was damaged goods, something to be pitied or feared. He paused by the window, looking out toward the meadow where they'd gathered flowers that morning. But then I started thinking about Marie, that French girl I told you about. She had every reason to be bitter about the world, to let other people's judgments define what her life could be. Instead, she chose to create beauty wherever she went. She taught me that what other people think about you matters a lot less than what you choose to do with your days. Elena followed his gaze toward the meadow, now bathed in the golden light of approaching sunset. In the distance, she could see birds moving among the wildflowers, and somewhere a stream gurgled quietly over stones. It was hard to imagine a more peaceful setting, or one further removed from the violent reputation that supposedly surrounded its inhabitant. So you just decided to let them think what they wanted, she said. I decided to focus on things that actually mattered, Tom corrected gently. Learning about the flowers, figuring out how to help myself sleep better, maybe helping others if the opportunity ever came up. The stories people told about me, they were about someone who didn't really exist. I couldn't control that, but I could control who I actually chose to be. As they walked back toward the cabin in the gathering dusk, Elena found herself thinking about her own situation in new ways. She'd been so focused on running from Marcus Holloway and the lies he'd spread about her that she'd barely considered what she might be running toward. But Tom's example suggested a different approach, one that involved building something positive rather than simply fleeing from something negative. What made you decide to trust me? She asked, as they reached the cabin's front porch. Given what happened with Crawford, why would you risk helping another stranger? Tom settled into a rough-hewn chair, and gestured for Elena to take the one beside it. The evening air was cooling rapidly now that the sun had disappeared behind the western peaks, but it felt refreshing rather than cold. Because you reminded me of Marie, he said, echoing what he'd told her the night before. But also because you reminded me of myself, right after I got home from the war. That look people get when they're trying to disappear, like maybe if they're quiet enough and small enough, the world will forget about them and leave them alone. Elena recognized the truth of that observation. She had been trying to disappear, to become invisible until Marcus Holloway's attention moved on to some other target. The idea that her desperate attempt at concealment had actually been what convinced Tom to help her was both ironic and oddly comforting. Plus, Tom continued with a slight smile, you weren't carrying a knife or trying to break into my cabin. That put you ahead of Crawford from the start. They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the mountains. Elena could hear the night sounds of the forest awakening around them, the soft hoot of owls beginning their hunting, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush, the distant splash of something drinking from the stream. It was a world away from the constant noise and tension of Charlotte, from the feeling of always being watched and judged and found wanting. "Tom," she said eventually, "what you're doing here with the flowers and the pillows and helping people sleep better, it's important work. More important than most people probably realize." Tom turned to look at her, his scarred face barely visible in the starlight. "How do you figure?" he asked. Elena thought about her own experience over the past week, how the simple gift of peaceful sleep had begun to restore not just her physical energy, but her ability to think clearly and hope for the future. "Because sleep is when healing happens," she said, "not just for bodies, but for minds and hearts too. When people can't rest properly, everything else in their lives gets harder. The work you do, it gives people back their foundation for getting better." Tom was quiet for a long moment, and Elena wondered if she'd overstepped somehow, made claims about his work that he wasn't comfortable with. "Marie used to say something similar," he said finally. "She told me that flowers weren't magic, but they were the next best thing because they reminded people that growing and healing were possible even in terrible circumstances." "She sounds like she was wise beyond her years," Elena said. "She was," Tom agreed, "and brave in ways that had nothing to do with fighting or violence. The kind of bravery that chooses to create beauty when it would be easier to give up." Elena pulled her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as the mountain air continued to cool. Above them, the stars were becoming visible in earnest, more of them than she'd ever seen from Charlotte's city streets. "I want to learn more," she said impulsively, "not just about the flowers and the pillows, but about living the way you do, about building something meaningful instead of just running from what's broken." Tom studied her face in the dim light, and Elena had the sense that he was evaluating not just her words but her commitment to following through on them. "It's not easy work," he warned. "Takes patience and willingness to fail a lot before you succeed. And it's lonely sometimes, especially when people misunderstand what you're trying to accomplish." "I'm already lonely," Elena pointed out, "and I'm already failing at the life I was trying to live before. At least this way I'd be failing at something worthwhile." Tom's quiet laugh held no mockery, only recognition of a truth he'd probably faced himself at some point. "All right then," he said, "we'll start with the advanced lessons tomorrow. Time you learned about the flowers that don't grow in Sunrise Meadow, the ones that require more effort to find but have properties you can't get anywhere else." Elena felt a flutter of excitement at the prospect of deeper knowledge, of skills that would take her beyond the basics she'd learned that day. "What kind of flowers?" she asked. "Mountain ginseng for one," Tom said. "Grows in deep shade on north-facing slopes, takes years to mature properly. But when you find it, the roots have qualities that can help with the kind of deep exhaustion that comes from long trauma." Elena thought about the bone-deep weariness that had plagued her for months before coming to Cedar Ridge, the kind of tiredness that sleep alone couldn't seem to touch. "And wild valerian," Tom continued. "Tricky to identify if you don't know what to look for, and dangerous if you confuse it with similar plants. But processed correctly, it's one of the most effective natural remedies for severe anxiety and panic." "You think I need those kinds of remedies?" Elena asked, curious about what Tom had observed in her condition, that she might not have recognized herself. "I think," Tom said carefully, "that you're carrying more weight than just the immediate fear of whoever's chasing you. I think there's older hurt underneath, the kind that settles deep and changes how a person moves through the world." Elena felt exposed by the accuracy of his observation, but not violated. Tom's assessment came from a place of recognition, rather than judgment, the way someone who'd walked a similar path might identify familiar landmarks. "You're not wrong," she admitted. "The situation with Marcus Holloway, that's just the most recent problem. There's been others before him, other people who saw something in me they wanted to control or possess or destroy. Men who thought you were something they could own," Tom said. "And it wasn't a question. Men who thought I was something they could use," Elena corrected. "For money or status, or just because they could.
It took me a long time to understand that the problem wasn't something wrong with me, it was something wrong with how they saw women in general. Tom nodded, his expression understanding in the way that spoke of personal familiarity with being misunderstood and misrepresented. Learning about the deeper acting plants, he said, it might help with that older hurt as well as the newer fear. But it's more complex work, requires understanding not just which flowers to use but when and how much, and in what combinations. I want to learn, Elena said without hesitation, whatever it takes, however long it requires. I want to understand how to heal from things that go deeper than just surface wounds. Tom stood and stretched, his joints creaking slightly in the mountain cold. Then we'll start early tomorrow, he said. The ginseng hunt requires a full day, and we'll need to get started before the sun's up if we want to make it to the good patches and back before dark. As Elena made her way back to the shed that night, she noticed that Tom had already prepared the next day's pillow arrangement. But tonight's flowers were different from any she'd seen before, darker and more exotic, with scents that seemed to carry whispers of deeper mysteries. Wild ginger root had been woven among the stems, and what looked like dried berries from some mountain shrub she couldn't identify. She settled into her blankets with both her original pillow and the new one she'd constructed that afternoon, comparing their scents and effects. The one Tom had made carried its familiar combination of calm authority and gentle comfort, while her own attempt provided a lighter, less complex fragrance that was nonetheless pleasant and soothing. But it was the arrangement outside her door that intrigued her most. The unfamiliar flowers seemed to promise something beyond simple rest, some deeper restoration that went beyond the healing she'd already experienced. As Elena drifted toward sleep, she found herself looking forward not just to tomorrow's lessons, but to the possibility of becoming someone who could offer such gifts to others who wandered lost and wounded into the mountains. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was the sound of Tom moving quietly around his cabin, preparing for the next day's expedition, with the methodical care he brought to everything he did. There was something deeply comforting about knowing that somewhere nearby, someone was planning her continued education in the arts of healing and hope. When Elena woke near midnight, to the sound of footsteps on the mountain path, her first thought was that Tom must be pursuing some aspect of flower gathering that required work in darkness. But as she listened more carefully, she realized that the footsteps weren't coming from the direction of his cabin, and they weren't moving with Tom's familiar quiet confidence. These steps were heavier, less certain of the terrain, and they were accompanied by the kinds of sounds that spoke of multiple people trying to move quietly through unfamiliar forest. Voices, kept low but still audible in the night stillness, discussing directions and arguing about whether they'd taken the right path. Elena felt ice settle in her stomach as she recognized what she was hearing. Marcus Holloway's men had found her trail. She slipped from her blankets and crept to the shed door, peering through the gap toward the main cabin. A light was already burning in Tom's window, and she could see his silhouette moving purposefully around the interior. He'd heard the approaching voices too, and unlike Elena, he was preparing to meet them rather than hide. The voices were getting closer now, close enough for Elena to make out individual words. 3 men at least, possibly 4, and they were discussing the best way to approach the cabin without being seen from inside. They'd clearly done this kind of work before, coordinating their movements with the efficiency of people accustomed to hunting human prey. Elena's training from her desperate flight out of Charlotte told her to run deeper into the forest, to use the darkness, and her growing familiarity with the mountain trails, to put distance between herself and the hunters. But the thought of leaving Tom to face Marcus Holloway's men alone, especially when her presence had brought this danger to his peaceful sanctuary, felt like the worst kind of betrayal. As she wrestled with the decision, Tom's cabin door opened, and he stepped onto the porch, moving with the quiet confidence she'd come to associate with his morning flower-gathering expeditions. But tonight he wasn't carrying botanical specimens. Tonight he carried something that caught the starlight with metallic gleams, and his posture had shifted from the gentle patience of a healer to something altogether more dangerous. Elena realized that the townspeople's stories about Thomas Wade might have contained more truth than she'd understood. even if they'd gotten the context completely wrong. Tom might prefer gathering wildflowers to engaging in violence, but that didn't mean he'd forgotten the skills that had kept him alive in French trenches. The approaching voices had gone silent now, which meant Marcus Holloway's men had spotted the light in the cabin, and were probably surrounding the clearing. Elena found herself caught between her instinct to flee, and her desire to help the man who'd shown her such unexpected kindness. But she also understood that she had no skills that would be useful in the kind of confrontation that seemed inevitable. What she could do, she realized, was make sure their search ended tonight rather than continuing indefinitely. If she was going to be found anyway, better that it happened here where Tom might have some advantage, rather than after days of cat-and-mouse games that would only increase the danger to everyone involved. Elena took a deep breath, picked up the pillow Tom had made for her, and stepped out of the shed into the mountain darkness. Whatever happened next, she would face it as someone who'd chosen her ground, rather than someone who'd been run to earth like a frightened animal. The night air was cold against her face, and somewhere in the forest around the clearing, Marcus Holloway's hunters were closing in. But Elena Brooks was no longer the same woman who'd fled Charlotte in desperation and terror. She'd learned things in the past week that went deeper than botanical knowledge or pillow-making techniques. She'd learned that healing was possible even after terrible damage, that gentleness could coexist with strength, and that sometimes the people the world labeled as monsters were the ones most capable of genuine kindness. As she walked toward the cabin where Tom waited to defend not just his own peace but hers as well, Elena realized that she was no longer running from her future. She was walking toward it, pillow in hand, and wildflower scents in her hair, ready to discover what kind of woman she could become when she stopped letting other people's fears and prejudices define the limits of her world. The clearing held its breath as Elena walked toward Tom's cabin, her bare feet silent on the cool earth. Behind her she could sense movement in the tree line, shadows shifting with predatory patience. 3 men, maybe 4, positioned to cut off escape routes and force whatever confrontation they'd come here to create. But Elena was done running, done making herself small in hopes that cruelty would overlook her. Tom stood on his porch like a sentinel, and in the starlight, Elena could see he held an old army rifle with the easy familiarity of someone who'd once depended on such weapons for survival. His scarred face was calm, almost peaceful, but there was something in his posture that spoke of coiled readiness, the kind of stillness that preceded decisive action. "Elena," he said quietly as she approached, his voice carrying no surprise. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," she replied, climbing the porch steps to stand beside him. "They came here because of me. That makes it my responsibility." From the forest edge, a voice called out with the false joviality that bullies used when they thought they held all the advantages. "Thomas Wade, we're looking for a woman who might have wandered up your way. Young lady with dark hair, goes by Elena Brooks. We're here to escort her safely back to Charlotte." Tom's grip on his rifle shifted almost imperceptibly, and Elena felt rather than saw him preparing for violence. But she placed a gentle hand on his arm, the way she might calm a startled horse. "Let me," she said quietly. Elena stepped forward to the edge of the porch, making herself visible in the lamplight spilling from the cabin's windows. The pillow Tom had made for her remained clutched against her chest, its herbal scents providing an anchor of calm in the storm of her accelerating heartbeat. "Marcus Holloway sent you," she called out to the hidden men. "Which means you're not here to escort me anywhere. You're here to drag me back to face charges that we all know are fabricated." A different voice responded, harder and more direct than the first. "Miss Brooks, you've caused Mr. Holloway considerable trouble. Time to come home and settle accounts like a civilized person." Elena felt laughter bubbling up from some deep well of bitter understanding. Civilized, as if there was anything civilized about the system that had allowed Marcus Holloway to destroy her reputation, steal her inheritance, and then send armed men to hunt her through the wilderness when she'd refused to submit quietly to his machinations. "I know what Marcus told you about me," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "That I'm a thief, a liar, someone who stole from him and ran when I was caught. But Marcus Holloway is the thief, and the liar, and the one who runs when his victims fight back instead of folding like he expects them to. Miss Brooks, the first voice said again, and Elena could hear movement now, the sound of men emerging from concealment to show themselves in the clearing. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Come with us peaceful-like, and nobody has to get hurt. 3 men stepped into view, exactly as Elena had predicted. They were dressed like businessmen, in good coats and polished shoes that spoke of city money and city connections. But they moved like hunters, and Elena could see the bulges under their jackets that suggested they'd come prepared for resistance. The mountain man doesn't have to be part of this, the hard voice continued, and Elena realized they were trying to separate her from Tom, to make her feel isolated and outnumbered. This is between you and Mr. Holloway. No need to involve innocent folks. Tom stepped forward then, his rifle held in a way that managed to look casual while remaining clearly ready for use. Funny thing about innocent folks, he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people listen whether they wanted to or not. They tend to object when armed strangers show up on their property in the middle of the night, making threats and demands. The 3 men shifted uneasily, clearly having expected this to go differently. Elena suspected they'd been told they were dealing with a simple pursuit, a runaway woman who could be intimidated into compliance. The presence of a scarred veteran who showed no signs of backing down was complicating their straightforward plan. We don't want trouble with you, Wade, the first man said. Just let us take the woman and we'll be on our way. Can't do that, Tom replied mildly. See, Miss Brooks is a guest in my home, and I take that responsibility seriously. Mountain hospitality and all. Elena felt a flutter
of something that might have been hope. Tom wasn't abandoning her to face Marcus Holloway's hunters alone, but she also knew that his intervention would only make things worse in the long run. These men would report back about the scarred mountain man who'd interfered with their mission, and Marcus would send more hunters, better armed and more numerous. There's something you need to know, Elena called out, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Something Marcus Holloway didn't tell you when he hired you to track me down. The 3 men paused, clearly not expecting this development. Elena could see them exchanging glances, trying to determine if this was some kind of delaying tactic. Marcus didn't just steal my inheritance, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. He murdered my uncle to get access to it. Uncle James didn't die of heart failure like the death certificate says. Marcus poisoned him slowly over months, using compounds that mimicked natural illness. The silence that followed her words was different from the tactical quiet that had preceded it. This was the silence of men realizing they might have stepped into something far more complex and dangerous than they'd been prepared for. That's a serious accusation, miss, the hard voice said finally. You got proof of that? Elena reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small glass vial, one she'd carried with her throughout her desperate flight from Charlotte. In the lamplight, the liquid inside caught the glow like liquid amber. Uncle James was suspicious toward the end, she said, holding the vial up where the men could see it. He started saving samples of everything Marcus brought him to drink. This is from the tonic Marcus claimed would help with his heart condition. I had it analyzed by a chemist in Asheville before I had to run. She could see the uncertainty creeping into the hunters' faces. They'd been hired to retrieve a runaway thief, not to become accessories to covering up a murder. Arsenic, Elena said simply. Not enough to kill quickly, but plenty to cause the gradual organ failure that everyone assumed was natural illness in an older man. Tom moved almost imperceptibly closer to Elena's side, and she could feel his quiet support strengthening her resolve. For the first time in months, she wasn't facing her accusers alone. Even if that's true, the first man said, but his voice lacked the certainty it had carried before. It doesn't change the fact that Mr. Holloway has legal claims against you. Theft charges, breach of contract, damages to his business reputation. Legal claims based on forged documents, Elena replied. Contracts I never signed, using a signature Marcus copied from letters I'd written to my uncle. Business damages that stem from his own criminal activity being exposed. She could see the hunters wavering now, their simple mission transformed into something that might implicate them in far more serious crimes than they'd bargained for. The chemist in Asheville, Elena continued, pressing her advantage. He kept copies of his analysis. And I kept records of every forged document Marcus used against me, every falsified claim, every piece of evidence that proves he murdered my uncle to steal what was rightfully mine. Where are these records? The hard voice demanded. Elena smiled, and for the first time in the conversation, she felt like she held cards worth playing. Safe, she said simply, hidden where Marcus Holloway will never find them, but easily accessible to law enforcement officials who might be interested in investigating a murder case. The three men were definitely unsettled now, exchanging looks and having whispered conversations that Elena couldn't quite make out. She could see them reassessing their situation, weighing their loyalty to Marcus Holloway against the possibility of becoming entangled in a murder investigation. Here's what's going to happen, Elena said, taking control of the conversation for the first time since the hunters had appeared. You're going to return to Charlotte and tell Marcus Holloway that I'm prepared to present evidence of his crimes to the proper authorities. If he wants to avoid a murder trial, he'll withdraw all charges against me and return the inheritance he stole. And if he refuses? The first man asked. Elena felt Tom's presence beside her like an anchor, steady and unshakable. The past week had taught her that she was stronger than she'd believed, more capable of standing up to threats than her months of running had suggested. Then I'll make sure every newspaper between here and Atlanta knows the real story about Marcus Holloway's business practices, she said. Complete with chemical analysis, forged documents and testimony from witnesses who saw how he treated my uncle during his final months. The silence stretched long enough for Elena to hear an owl calling from somewhere deep in the forest. When the hunters finally spoke again, their voices carried a different quality, the sound of men who'd realized they were in over their heads. We'll need to report back to Mr. Holloway, the hard voice said finally. Get his instructions on how to proceed. You do that, Elena replied, but you tell him something else too. Tell him that Elena Brooks isn't running anymore. I've found my ground, and I'm prepared to defend it. The three men began backing away toward the forest edge, their movements careful but clearly indicating retreat. But the first man paused before disappearing into the trees. This isn't over, Miss Brooks, he called out. Mr. Holloway doesn't give up easy on things he considers his property. Elena felt anger flare in her chest at the casual way the man referred to her as property, but Tom's calm presence helped her maintain her composure. Then Marcus Holloway is going to learn that some things can't be owned, she replied. And some people fight back when you try to cage them. After the hunters disappeared into the forest darkness, Elena and Tom remained on the porch for long minutes, listening for any signs that the men might be circling back for another attempt. But the mountain gradually returned to its natural nighttime sounds, and eventually Tom lowered his rifle and looked at Elena with something that might have been admiration. That was well done, he said quietly. Took courage to face them down like that. Elena sank into one of the porch chairs, suddenly feeling the exhaustion that came after intense confrontation. The pillow she'd clutched throughout the entire encounter released its familiar sense of pine and mint, and she breathed deeply to calm her still racing heart. I couldn't have done it without you standing beside me, she said. Knowing I wasn't alone made all the difference. Tom settled into the other chair, his rifle propped against the porch railing but still within easy reach. What you said about the chemist's analysis, the hidden records, he said. That was all true. Elena nodded, pulling the glass vial from her pocket again, and examining it in the lamplight. Uncle James was sharper than Marcus gave him credit for, she said. Toward the end, when he started getting suspicious, he began keeping samples of everything, not just the tonics Marcus brought, but copies of documents, records of conversations, even a journal describing how his symptoms progressed. And you managed to save all of that. Most of it, Elena confirmed. I knew Marcus would come after me once Uncle James died, so I prepared. Hid copies of everything important in multiple locations. Made sure at least one set of documents was completely beyond his reach. Tom was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what Elena had revealed. "So you really can prove he murdered your uncle," he said finally. "I can prove he poisoned him systematically over a period of months," Elena corrected. "Whether that's enough to convict him of murder in a court of law, that's harder to say. Marcus has money and connections, the kind of influence that can make legal problems disappear. But it's enough to make those hunters think twice about continuing to work for him," Tom observed. Elena nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction at having finally gained some measure of control over her situation. "Marcus's power depends on people believing his version of events," she said. "Once that credibility starts to crack, everything else becomes much harder for him." They sat in comfortable silence as the mountains settled around them. Elena found herself thinking about the past week, how much had changed since she'd first hidden behind that oak tree, terrified and desperate, and convinced that Thomas Wade represented just another danger in a world that seemed determined to destroy her. "Tom," she said eventually, "what you've given me this week, it goes beyond just shelter and food. You've reminded me who I am underneath all the fear and running." Tom turned to look at her, his scarred face gentle in the lamplight. "You reminded yourself," he said quietly. "I just provided a safe place for you to remember." Elena thought about that, about the truth of it. The strength she'd shown tonight in facing down Marcus Holloway's hunters hadn't come from Tom, or from anyone else. It had come from some deep well inside herself, that had been buried under months of terror and self-doubt, but never truly destroyed. "The flower gathering, the pillow making teaching me about healing," she continued. "It wasn't just about learning practical skills, was it?" Tom's smile was knowing and warm. "Marie used to say that working with flowers taught people how to nurture growing things," he said, "including the growing things inside themselves that they'd forgotten were there." Elena understood now why Tom's simple acts of kindness had been so powerful. He hadn't just offered her physical safety, he'd offered her the opportunity to rediscover her own capacity for growth and strength. The daily ritual of wildflower arrangements hadn't just provided beautiful decoration, it had been a gradual reminder that she was worth the effort such beauty represented. "I want to stay," Elena said impulsively, "not just until this situation with Marcus is resolved, but permanently. I want to learn everything you can teach me about working with flowers, about creating the kind of healing you've developed here." Tom studied her face carefully, as if evaluating whether her offer came from genuine desire, or merely from fear of facing the world beyond the mountains. "It's not an easy life," he warned. "Isolated, sometimes lonely, and there's always the possibility that Marcus Holloway won't be satisfied with tonight's confrontation. He might come back with more men, better prepared." Elena considered that, weighing the risks against the sense of rightness she felt about making her stand here, in this place where she'd rediscovered her own strength. "Then we'll face him together," she said, "and maybe by then I'll know enough about mountain herbs to make his stay very uncomfortable." Tom's laugh was rich and genuine, the kind that spoke of real joy rather than mere amusement. "Marie would have liked you," he said. "She always said the best students were the ones who wanted to learn, not just the techniques, but the philosophy behind them." As the night deepened around them, Elena found herself looking forward to tomorrow in ways she hadn't experienced in months. Not with the desperate hope of someone grasping at straws, but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd found her path, and was ready to walk it with purpose. "We should probably get some sleep," Tom said eventually. "Tomorrow I want to show you the deep forest patches where the rarest healing plants grow. If you're going to stay and learn properly, you'll need to understand the full range of what these mountains have to offer." Elena nodded, but made no immediate move to leave the porch. The night air carried scents of pine and wildflowers, of clean water running over stones and the rich earth that nurtured growing things. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the soft call of night birds, and closer by, the gentle whisper of wind through the trees. "Tom," she said, as they finally prepared to part for the night, "thank you for seeing me as someone worth saving instead of someone too damaged to bother with." Tom paused at his cabin door, looking back at her with an expression of gentle understanding. "Elena," he said quietly, "I never saw you as someone who needed saving. From that very first morning, you struck me as someone who just needed the right conditions to save herself."
As Elena made her way back to the shed, she realized that Tom was right. The strength she'd shown tonight, the courage to face down Marcus Holloway's hunters and reclaim control of her own story, hadn't been given to her by anyone else. It had been there all along, buried under fear and self-doubt, but never truly destroyed. The pillow Tom had made for her smelled of mountain meadows and quiet mornings, of careful hands selecting each flower for its specific healing properties. But more than that, it smelled of hope, of the possibility that broken things could be made whole again, that people who'd been labeled as monsters or victims could choose to become something entirely different. Elena settled into her blankets, surrounded by the fading scent of wildflowers, listening to the mountain night settle around her. Tomorrow would bring new lessons in the ancient arts of healing and growing, new understanding of how gentleness could coexist with strength. And somewhere beyond these peaks Marcus Holloway would be receiving a report that would force him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the woman he tried to destroy. But tonight, Elena Brooks slept peacefully in a shed behind a cabin owned by a scarred mountain man, who gathered wildflowers at dawn, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, her dreams were filled not with running and hiding, but with growing things that reached toward the light. 6 months later, the first snow of winter dusted the peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains like powdered sugar on dark cake, and Elena Brooks stood in what had once been Tom's solitary workshop, now expanded into something that could properly be called a healing sanctuary. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each one carefully organized with glass jars, containing dried herbs, pressed flowers, and botanical preparations that would have seemed like magic to anyone who didn't understand the science behind their creation. The morning ritual had evolved too. Where once Tom had gathered flowers alone in the pre-dawn darkness, now Elena accompanied him, her knowledge of mountain botany having grown sophisticated enough that she could identify healing plants by touch in complete darkness. They moved through the familiar paths, like dancers who'd rehearsed their steps for years, each knowing instinctively where the other would move, what specimens they'd encounter, which preparations would be most needed for the day's work. But the most significant change wasn't visible in the expanded workshop, or Elena's botanical expertise. It was evident in the steady stream of visitors, who'd begun making their way up the mountain path, drawn by stories that bore no resemblance to the violent tales that had once kept people away from Cedar Ridge. Word had spread quietly through the valleys and townships, carried by those who'd experienced the deep restorative sleep that came from pillows stuffed with Tom and Elena's carefully blended herbs. Mountain folk, by nature suspicious of anything that sounded too good to be true, had been won over by results that spoke louder than any advertising could have managed. Mothers brought children, who suffered from night terrors. Old-timers arrived with the chronic pain that came from decades of hard physical labor, and increasingly war veterans made the difficult journey to seek help for the kinds of wounds that conventional medicine couldn't touch. Elena had discovered a gift for reading what people needed, not just in terms of which botanical combinations would address their specific ailments, but in understanding the deeper healing that came from being truly seen and heard by someone who didn't judge their struggles. Tom's technical expertise combined with Elena's intuitive compassion had created something neither could have accomplished alone. The workshop buzzed with quiet activity this particular morning, as Elena prepared a complex blend for a veteran who'd arrived the day before, a young man whose hands shook so violently he could barely hold a cup of coffee. Shell shock, Tom had diagnosed quietly, the kind of deep nervous system damage that conventional treatments rarely touched effectively. The preparation Elena was creating combined valerian root for calming the hypervigilant mind, passion flower for easing muscle tension, and a dozen other carefully selected ingredients that would work together to give the man's battered nervous system a chance to rest and repair.
Tom worked at the opposite end of the long table, preparing tinctures that would be incorporated into salves for treating the chronic joint pain that plagued so many of the mountain's older residents. His movements had the same methodical precision Elena remembered from her first lessons, but now she understood the depth of knowledge behind each careful measurement, each precisely timed step in the extraction process. "Elena," Tom said without looking up from his work, "we're going to need more wild ginseng roots soon. The widow Patterson's rheumatism preparation uses more than I initially calculated. Elena nodded, making a note in the journal where they tracked inventory and planned harvesting expeditions. The wild ginseng was one of their most valuable ingredients, requiring careful cultivation and sustainable harvesting practices to ensure it would continue growing in future seasons. I'll head up to the North Slope tomorrow, she replied. The plants I marked in September should be ready for partial root harvest. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the gravel path, heavier and more deliberate than the usual morning visitors. Elena looked up to see a well-dressed man approaching the workshop, his fine coat and polished boots marking him clearly as someone from the city rather than the local mountain communities they usually served. Tom's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the relaxed confidence of someone in his own domain being replaced by the alertness of a man who'd learned not to trust unexpected visitors bearing official appearances. Elena felt her own muscles tense as she recognized something familiar in the stranger's bearing, a quality that reminded her uncomfortably of Marcus Holloway's hunters. "Mr. Wade, Miss Brooks," the man called out as he approached the workshop entrance. "My name is Charles Whitman. I represent certain business interests that might be relevant to your work here." Elena and Tom exchanged a quick glance, communicating volumes in a single look. Neither had forgotten the confrontation 6 months earlier, or the possibility that Marcus Holloway might eventually find new ways to pursue his vengeance. "We're not interested in business partnerships," Tom said evenly, not moving away from his workbench but making it clear he was paying full attention to the unexpected visitor. Charles Whitman smiled, the kind of expression that was meant to be reassuring but somehow managed to convey exactly the opposite impression. "I think you might be once you understand what I'm proposing," he said, stepping closer to the workshop entrance. "Your reputation for producing effective herbal remedies has reached certain circles in Atlanta and Charlotte. There are people willing to pay substantial sums for access to your preparations." Elena felt ice settle in her stomach as she began to understand what kind of proposal they were facing. She'd seen this pattern before, the way that anything valuable or unique eventually attracted the attention of people who wanted to control it, package it, turn it into a source of profit rather than healing. "Our work isn't for sale," Elena said firmly, setting down the herbs she'd been processing and facing Whitman directly. "We help people who need healing, not people who can afford to pay the highest prices." Whitman's smile widened, but his eyes remained calculating and cold. "Miss Brooks, I think you might be misunderstanding the scope of what we're discussing. My associates represent pharmaceutical interests with the resources to expand your work far beyond what's possible in this isolated mountain setting. Imagine being able to help thousands of people instead of the handful who can make the journey to Cedar Ridge." Tom moved closer to Elena's side, and she could feel the quiet strength of his presence anchoring her as she processed what Whitman was really proposing. "What you're describing sounds like mass production," she said carefully, "turning healing preparations into commercial products. That's not the same thing as what we do here. It's evolution," Whitman countered smoothly. "Taking your folk remedies and turning them into legitimate medicines that can be distributed through proper channels, regulated for safety and effectiveness, made available to people who need them most." Elena almost laughed at the transparent manipulation in Whitman's pitch. She'd heard similar arguments from Marcus Holloway, the same appeals to broader benefit that masked purely selfish motivations. "And what happens to the people we serve now?" she asked. "The mountain families who can't afford commercial pharmaceuticals, the veterans who need individualized preparations that can't be mass-produced." Whitman waved dismissively, as if such concerns were trivial details that could be worked out later. "There are charitable programs that can address those needs," he said. "What's important is ensuring that your innovations reach their full potential, generate the resources necessary to fund proper research and development." Tom spoke for the first time since Whitman had begun his pitch, his voice carrying the quiet authority that Elena had learned to associate with moments when his patience was being tested. "Whitman," he said calmly, "you seem to be operating under some fundamental misunderstandings about what we do here and why we do it." Whitman turned to face Tom directly, clearly having expected Elena to be the easier target for his persuasion attempts. I understand that you've developed effective herbal preparations using traditional methods, Whitman said. What you might not understand is the legal and regulatory environment that governs such work. Without proper oversight and documentation, you're operating in a gray area that could become problematic. Elena felt anger flare in her chest at the thinly veiled threat. This was exactly the kind of institutional pressure that had driven her to the mountains in the first place. The way that power and money always found ways to coerce people into compliance with systems designed to benefit those who were already wealthy. Are you suggesting we're doing something illegal? She asked, her voice sharp with challenge. I'm suggesting, Whitman replied carefully, that the regulatory landscape is complex and changing. Having proper representation and resources can be valuable for ensuring continued operations. Tom set down his work implements and turned to face Whitman fully, and Elena could see the transformation that had occurred the night they'd faced Marcus Holloway's hunters. The gentle healer was still there, but underneath was the steady strength of someone who'd survived war, and wouldn't be easily intimidated. Mr. Whitman, Tom said quietly, I think this conversation has gone about as far as it's going to go. We appreciate your interest, but we're not looking for business partners or pharmaceutical representation. Whitman's expression hardened slightly, the friendly facade slipping enough to reveal something more calculating underneath. That's unfortunate, he said. My associates were hoping this could be handled as a straightforward business arrangement. There are other approaches available, of course, but they tend to be more complicated for everyone involved. Elena stepped forward, placing herself directly between Whitman and Tom, her body language making it clear that she was prepared to defend what they'd built here. Mr. Whitman, she said, her voice carrying the kind of steel that came from having faced down threats before and survived them. I think you should know that we're not as isolated or vulnerable as you might assume. We have friends in these mountains, people who value what we do and wouldn't appreciate seeing it threatened. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from multiple directions around the clearing. Elena smiled as she recognized the distinctive gait patterns of several regular visitors, mountain folk who'd learned to coordinate their morning arrivals to share news and check on each other's well-being. Old Ben McGillicuddy emerged from the eastern trail, his arthritic joints moving more freely than they had in years thanks to the salve Tom and Elena had prepared for him. From the south came Ruth Campbell, whose chronic insomnia had been replaced by peaceful sleep after Elena had created a customized pillow blend for her specific needs. The western path brought Jake Morrison, a veteran whose shell shock had improved dramatically over the past months of regular treatment. But it wasn't just the regular visitors. Elena realized with growing amazement that word of Whitman's arrival had somehow spread through the mountain community's informal communication network because people were arriving who didn't usually make the journey to Cedar Ridge. Families from distant valleys, elderly mountain women known for their own herbal knowledge, even a few of the more reclusive residents who rarely interacted with outsiders. Within minutes, Whitman found himself surrounded by perhaps 20 mountain residents, all of whom had direct experience with Tom and Elena's work, and none of whom looked particularly pleased to hear that outside interests were trying to interfere with arrangements that were working perfectly well as they stood. Mr. Old Ben said, his weathered face creased with disapproval, these folks here have helped more people in the past 6 months than all the doctors in 3 counties combined. Whatever you're selling, we ain't interested in buying. Ruth Campbell stepped forward, her expression fierce despite her small stature. Elena Brooks and Tom Wade are under the protection of this community, she said formally, using the kind of language that carried serious weight in mountain culture. Anyone who threatens them or their work will answer to all of us. Whitman looked around the circle of stern mountain faces and seemed to realize that his carefully planned intimidation strategy had backfired spectacularly. These weren't isolated targets who could be pressured into compliance. They were part of a community that took care of its own and didn't respond well to outside threats. I think there might be some misunderstanding, Whitman said, his tone becoming more conciliatory as he recognized the shift in power dynamics. We're not threatening anyone. We're simply offering business opportunities that could benefit everyone involved. Jake Morrison stepped forward and Elena could see that his hands were steady, his posture confident in ways that would have been impossible before Tom's treatments had helped heal his war-damaged nervous system. "Mr. Whitman," Jake said quietly, "in the Army, we learned to recognize when someone was trying to take something that didn't belong to them. We also learned how to respond to such situations." The circle of mountain residents moved closer, not threateningly but with the kind of unified purpose that made it clear Whitman's welcome had expired. Elena felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sunshine. These people, many of whom had been strangers 6 months ago, were standing up to protect the healing sanctuary she and Tom had created together. "Perhaps," Whitman said, backing toward the path that led down the mountain, "I should return when you've had more time to consider the opportunities we're offering." "Don't bother," Tom said simply. "Our answer isn't going to change." After Whitman disappeared down the trail, followed at a discreet distance by several of the younger mountain men to ensure he actually left the area, the assembled crowd began to disperse gradually. But not before each person had taken a moment to speak privately with Elena and Tom, offering whatever support they could provide and making it clear that any future threats would be met with unified resistance. Elena found herself deeply moved by the loyalty these mountain families were showing. She'd spent years in Charlotte surrounded by people who'd known her name and social position but had abandoned her the moment Marcus Holloway's accusations made supporting her inconvenient. Here in the mountains, people who'd started as strangers had become genuine friends, relationships built on mutual respect and shared values rather than social connections or business interests. "That was well handled," Tom said as they watched the last of their supporters disappear back into the forest. "Though I suspect we haven't heard the last of Mr. Whitman's associates." Elena nodded, understanding that the morning's confrontation was likely just the beginning of a larger campaign. The work they were doing had become too visible, too successful to remain completely under the radar of people who saw profit potential in everything. "We'll need to be more careful," she said, thinking about the various precautions they could implement to protect both their work and the people who depended on their services. "We'll need to be smarter," Tom corrected gently. "There's a difference between hiding from threats and being prepared to meet them on our own terms." Elena smiled, recognizing the wisdom in that distinction. They'd already proven they could face direct confrontation and emerge victorious. What they needed now was the kind of strategic thinking that would let them continue their healing work without constantly looking over their shoulders. That afternoon, while Tom worked on filling orders for several regular customers, Elena made her way to a secluded spot near Whispering Falls where she'd begun cultivating some of the more sensitive medicinal plants. The sound of water cascading over rocks provided a peaceful backdrop for thinking, and Elena had found that some of her best insights came during the quiet hours she spent tending to growing things. As she worked among the carefully tended herbs, Elena reflected on how much her life had changed since that desperate morning when she'd hidden behind an oak tree, terrified and convinced that Thomas Wade represented just another danger in a hostile world. The woman who'd created false identities and fled across state lines seemed like a stranger now, someone she remembered with sympathy but no longer identified with completely. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been built through hundreds of small moments, daily choices to trust rather than fear, to learn rather than hide, to create rather than simply survive. Tom's patient teaching had been part of it, but equally important had been her own decision to believe that she was worth the effort healing required. Elena was so absorbed in her thoughts and her work that she almost missed the sound of approaching footsteps. But her time in the mountains had sharpened her awareness of environmental changes, and she looked up to see a familiar figure making his way carefully down the rocky path beside the falls. Marcus Holloway looked older than she remembered, his expensive clothes travel-worn and his usually perfect grooming showing signs of the difficult journey to reach Cedar Ridge. But his eyes held the same calculating intelligence that had made him so dangerous, and Elena felt her muscles tense as she prepared for whatever confrontation he'd come to create. "Elena," Marcus said as he reached the small clearing where she worked, his voice carrying the same smooth charm that had once fooled her into trusting his intentions. "You've led me quite a chase, my dear." Elena stood slowly, her hands remaining steady as she set aside the herbs she'd been processing. 6 months of mountain living had changed her physically as well as emotionally. She was stronger now, more centered, with the kind of confidence that came from knowing she could take care of herself in challenging circumstances. "Marcus," she replied calmly. "I wondered when you'd work up the courage to come yourself instead of sending hired men." Marcus smiled, the expression that had once seemed charming now revealing itself as the predatory calculation it had always been. "I've always preferred handling important business personally," he said, moving closer with the casual confidence of someone who expected to intimidate through mere presence. "Though I have to say, this little mountain hideaway is quite picturesque. Very romantic, playing house with the local hermit." Elena felt anger flare at the dismissive way Marcus characterized her relationship with Tom, but she also recognized the tactic for what it was. Marcus had always tried to control conversations by making other people react emotionally to his provocations. "What do you want, Marcus?" she asked directly, refusing to engage with his attempts at manipulation. "What I've always wanted," Marcus replied smoothly. "What's rightfully mine. Your uncle's assets, compensation for the damage your accusations have done to my reputation, and assurance that you'll stop spreading lies about my business practices." Elena almost laughed at the transparent attempt to reframe the situation. Even now, faced with the woman he'd tried to destroy, Marcus was maintaining the fiction that he was the wronged party seeking justice. "Your business practices," Elena said carefully, "included poisoning my uncle and forging documents to steal his property. Those aren't accusations, Marcus. They're facts supported by evidence that's safely beyond your reach." Marcus's expression hardened slightly, the charming mask slipping enough to reveal the ruthless calculation underneath. "Evidence that no one will ever see if you're sensible about resolving this situation quietly," he said. "I'm prepared to be generous, Elena. Drop your claims, stop interfering with my business relationships, and I'll make sure you're comfortable for the rest of your life." "Under your control," Elena said, understanding exactly what kind of comfort Marcus was offering. "Under my protection," Marcus corrected smoothly. "The world can be dangerous for a woman on her own, especially one with a reputation for making wild accusations against respected businessmen." Elena heard the threat clearly, but she also heard something else that Marcus probably hadn't intended to reveal. There was uncertainty in his voice, a quality she'd never detected during their previous encounters. For the first time, Marcus Holloway seemed less than completely confident in his ability to control the situation. "The thing is, Marcus," Elena said, taking a step closer to him instead of backing away, "I'm not on my own anymore, and the people who stand with me aren't impressed by your reputation or your threats." As if summoned by her words, Tom's voice called out from the path above the falls. "Elena, everything all right down there?" Marcus's eyes flicked toward the sound, and Elena saw real nervousness there for the first time. Whatever research he'd done on Thomas Wade had apparently included the violent stories that still circulated in some circles, and Marcus was clearly uncertain about his ability to handle a confrontation with someone who had actual combat experience. "Everything's fine, Tom," Elena called back. "Just having a conversation with an old acquaintance from Charlotte." Tom appeared at the top of the rocky path, and even at that distance Elena could see him assessing the situation with the quick evaluation skills that had kept him alive in war zones. His posture was relaxed but ready, and Elena knew he would be beside her in seconds if she indicated any need for assistance. "Mr. Holloway, I assume," Tom said, his voice carrying easily across the water sounds. "Heard you might be visiting our area." Marcus looked up at the scarred figure above them, and Elena could see him recalculating the dynamics of the confrontation he'd expected to control easily. "Mr. Wade," Marcus said, attempting to regain his commanding presence. "I hope Elena has mentioned that this is a private family matter. Nothing that need concern the local residents." Tom began making his way down the rocky path with the sure-footed confidence of someone completely at home in the mountain environment. "Funny thing about family matters," Tom said as he descended. "Around here, we consider Elena part of our family. That makes her concerns our concerns." Elena felt a surge of warmth at Tom's words, not just because of the protection they offered,
but because of the genuine affection they represented. The mountain community had become more than just allies. They had become the kind of family she'd never experienced even when surrounded by blood relatives. Marcus seemed to realize that his carefully planned confrontation was spiraling away from his control. He was outnumbered, out of his element, and facing people who had no reason to be impressed by his wealth or social connections. "Elena," he said, making one final attempt to establish dominance, "I think you should consider very carefully what you're choosing here. These mountain people, they're not your kind. You don't belong in this primitive place, playing with weeds and living like a peasant." Elena looked around the clearing where she'd been working, taking in the carefully tended medicinal plants, the sound of clean water running over stones, the clean mountain air that carried scents of pine and growing things. Then she looked at Tom, whose presence represented not just safety but genuine partnership in work that mattered. "Marcus," she said finally, "you're absolutely right. I don't belong in the world you represent. I never did, even when I tried to convince myself otherwise." She moved to stand beside Tom, their shoulders almost touching, presenting a united front that made their partnership unmistakable. "This is where I belong," Elena continued. "With people who value healing over profit, who measure success by the help they provide rather than the wealth they accumulate. You can keep your world of lies and manipulation and casual cruelty. I'm building something better." Marcus stared at them for a long moment, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of bitter resignation. Elena realized that on some level he genuinely believed she would eventually return to him, that her mountain exile was just a temporary rebellion that would end when she came to her senses. "This isn't over," Marcus said finally, the words carrying less conviction than Elena thought he'd intended. "Yes it is," Elena replied calmly. "Your power over me ended the moment I stopped caring what people in your world thought about me. Everything else is just you refusing to accept reality." Marcus turned and began making his way back up the path, his expensive city shoes slipping on the damp rocks in ways that emphasized how completely out of place he was in the mountain environment. Elena watched him go with a sense of completion rather than victory. This confrontation represented the final severing of ties to a life that had never truly fit her. "You all right?" Tom asked quietly, his hand touching her shoulder with gentle concern. Elena nodded, surprised to realize that she felt lighter rather than stressed after the encounter with Marcus. For months, the possibility of such a confrontation had loomed over her like a storm cloud. Now that it had actually happened, she discovered that Marcus Holloway had lost most of his power to frighten her. "Better than all right," she said, turning to smile at Tom. "I think that might have been exactly the conversation I needed to have." As they made their way back to the workshop together, Elena reflected on how completely her priorities had shifted over the past months. The woman who'd fled Charlotte had been focused primarily on escape, on putting distance between herself and the people who wanted to control or destroy her. But the woman walking beside Tom through mountain paths was focused on building something positive, on using her skills and knowledge to create healing and comfort for people who genuinely needed both. That evening, as they worked together processing the day's harvest and preparing remedies for the next day's visitors, Elena found herself thinking about the future in ways that had nothing to do with fear or survival strategies. For the first time in years, she was planning beyond the immediate crisis, imagining projects that would take months or years to complete, envisioning the kind of life she wanted to build rather than the disasters she needed to avoid. "Tom," she said, as they organized jars of dried herbs on the workshop shelves, "I've been thinking about expanding what we do here. Not in the way Whitman was suggesting, but in ways that would let us help more people without compromising the quality of what we provide." Tom paused in his work, giving her his full attention in the way that had become one of her favorite things about their partnership. "What kind of expansion?" he asked. "Teaching," Elena said, warming to the idea as she spoke. "Bringing people here for longer stays, showing them how to identify and process their own medicinal plants. We could create a place where knowledge gets shared instead of hoarded, where healing traditions get passed down properly." Tom's smile was slow and genuine, the kind that spoke of real enthusiasm rather than polite interest. Marie would have loved that idea, he said. She always said the best medicine was the kind people could provide for themselves and their families. Elena felt a deep sense of rightness about the direction her thoughts were taking. The work they were doing was valuable, but it would be even more valuable if it could be multiplied through teaching others to carry on similar practices in their own communities. We could start small, she continued, her excitement growing as the possibilities expanded in her mind. Maybe bring in a few people at a time, teach them seasonal cycles, harvesting techniques, preparation methods. Eventually build a network of people doing similar work across the region. A healing tradition that grows from the ground up instead of being imposed from above. Tom said, understanding immediately what Elena was envisioning. Exactly, Elena confirmed. Something that belongs to the communities it serves instead of to pharmaceutical companies or business interests. As they continued planning through the evening, Elena realized that her conversation with Marcus Holloway had accomplished something unexpected. Instead of representing a threat to be survived, his visit had clarified her own vision for the future and strengthened her commitment to the path she'd chosen. The life she was building with Tom wasn't a retreat from the world but a foundation for engaging with it in more meaningful ways. Late that night, as Elena settled into sleep, surrounded by the familiar scents of pine and mountain herbs, she found herself thinking not about the danger she'd escaped, but about the possibilities stretching ahead. Somewhere beyond these peaks, people were struggling with problems that the right knowledge could address. Communities were losing connection to traditional healing practices that had sustained their ancestors for generations. Veterans were returning from wars with wounds that conventional medicine couldn't touch. But here in the mountains, Elena Brooks and Thomas Wade were developing solutions that could spread far beyond Cedar Ridge, carried by people who understood that true healing happened one person at a time, one community at a time, one carefully selected wildflower at a time. Elena drifted toward sleep, thinking about meadows full of healing plants, about students who would return to their own communities, carrying knowledge that could transform lives, about a future built on gentleness and growing things rather than violence and control. And somewhere in the cabin nearby, Tom Wade was probably dreaming similar dreams, planning tomorrow's lessons and next season's plantings and all the ways they could continue turning what had once been symbols of isolation into foundations for connection and healing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.